Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Sonic the Hedgehog meets his match in the third film entry. Shadow the Hedgehog, voiced by Keanu Reeves, escapes after being held captive for 50 years. Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, voiced by Ben Schwartz, Colleen O'Shaughnessy, and Idris Elba respectively, are sent by Gunn to capture Shadow, but soon realise that Gunn can't be trusted. Team Sonic forge an uneasy alliance with Ivo Robotnik, played by Jim Carrey, putting them on a collision course with Shadow and Robotnik's long-lost grandfather Gerald, also played by Carrey, who are plotting a devastating revenge. The third film adaptation of the popular Sega video game character, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, is once again directed by Jeff Fowler, who helmed the previous two films, and Violent Night screenwriters Pat Casey and Josh Miller also return, having now written all three films in the series. John Whittington also returns as a co-writer from Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and is also the co-creator of the Knuckles spin-off series, which was actually developed simultaneously with this third film. If you haven't seen Knuckles, because chances are you don't have a Paramount Plus subscription, don't worry, it has very little impact on the plot of this film, and I should know because I saw this without having watched that. So this is very much reuniting the team that's been on a winning formula with these Sonic films, especially considering the infamous start they had with that original design for Sonic that literally everyone hated and became an instant punchline. But they took the feedback from that and improved it at great expense. But that, I think, has been the secret to the franchise's success on film. They've been listening to their core audience and delivering what they want out of these movies. And clearly Paramount wants to keep the team together because they've already announced a fourth film before this third movie was even released. And Sonic 3 is further evidence, in my opinion, that these films are improving with each entry, and that video game films are not always the total dross they've been for many, many years. Even with the odd slip-up you still get like Borderlands. So this time around, Sonic's arc in the film, now that he has Tails and Knuckles as a kind of family, is about teamwork, especially if they have to work together as a unit. At the beginning of the film, the three characters are introduced racing against each other, trying to see who is the fastest. Unfortunately, that sibling competitiveness also bleeds into their missions sometimes. They have all the elements of a good team. Sonic is the leader, Tails does the gadgets, and Knuckles is the muscle. But it's usually when Sonic tries to tackle things on his own instead, that's when things very quickly go wrong. You see this in their first time encountering Shadow, where he quickly leaves them behind to chase after him, which only really makes things worse. And that emphasis on family, Vin Diesel would definitely approve, is a grounding for Sonic. He's had that guidance from James Marsden's Tom, but also Ravenclaw back in the very first film, which this calls back to very early on when Sonic revisits the old cave that he used to live in. Sonic's got a lot of power and energy at his disposal, but he needs to learn how to focus and harness it in the best way. And if these ideas of great power and great responsibility and what it means to be a hero seem a bit familiar, then that's because these films, in my opinion, are very much in the vein of superhero movies. When someone calls Sonic an alien at one point, they could just as easily be talking about Superman. One could even argue that these Sonic films are actually a stepping stone for young viewers into things like the MCU, in that the Sonic franchise has its own mythology and cast of characters that much of the audience will be already familiar with going in, and kids often lose their minds at the teasers during the credits, promising the next character to be introduced in the following sequel. Yeah, now that I think about it, that does sound a lot like Marvel films. And Fowler and his team are clearly treating these characters with a lot of care and respect, that they get their dynamics and personalities right, while still having a lot of heart and sincerity in the storytelling. Ben Schwartz allowed plenty of room for wisecracks as Sonic, even managing to squeeze in a B. Arthur joke, which is frankly more B. Arthur jokes than I would expect out of a Sonic movie, but he's also a little less grating than he was perhaps sometimes in the previous films. But for me, Idris Elba but also gets some amusing moments as Knuckles, because he tries to solve nearly every situation with his fist, but they also give him a sense of honour, which means that he's not a total buffoon of a character. Colleen O'Shaughnessy just slots right back into her usual role as Tails, although I did think the character was a bit sidelined in this outing. But that emphasis on family and choosing the right path is obviously meant to contrast Sonic's upbringing with Shadow's, who's experienced nothing but tragedy and loss. And bringing Keanu Reeves, like Idris Elba before him, is a great bit of stunt casting, clearly playing on his John Wick persona. There's an early scene where Shadow is wandering through the streets of Tokyo in the rain that's very John Wick, especially those opening scenes of Chapter 4, and Reeves voices the character with the same quiet intensity that he brought to John Wick, so calmly assured of his power that he doesn't even need to be overtly menacing because he doesn't see Sonic as a threat. Reeves is clearly committed to the character, and he has to, because the film's most emotional moments are connected to him, but he's also kinda sending himself up a little bit, trying to give a little levity to Shadow's brooding self-seriousness, deadpanning lines like, "Revenge, Quark," almost like they've got a kind of gravitas to them. But the presence of a character like Shadow, who is hell-bent on vengeance, indicates that this is a darker sequel than its predecessors. Not so much so that it's inappropriate for kids who are the target audience, but the stakes here are much higher than the earlier films, and this is also a movie where people do die or are seriously injured. Again, that likely won't come as a surprise to the target audience who are familiar with the games, who likely know the kind of stuff that I'm referring to, especially with regards to Shadow's backstory, and it's a credit to the creators for not pulling their punches too much when bringing it to film. That definitely means there are moments where the tone is a bit of a juggling act, because this is a kids' film about the destructive futility of revenge. It's also a movie where Jim Carrey spanks himself with an oversized robot hand, and sometimes Sonic 3 veers between those two things within the same sequence. But speaking of Carrey, he's the main reason why I see these films. He's a childhood hero of mine, and I grew up with his movies. When I see Carrey mugging for the camera, my inner 10-year-old is absolutely delighted. And Carrey has always been perfect casting as Robotnik. He's maybe the only actor around who's enough of a cartoon to keep up with his animated co-stars, and I think he's especially at his most fun when he's playing a villain, and now we get him to the power of 2. After Carrey threatened to retire following the second film unless he got, quote, a golden script, it appears the filmmakers attempted to do everything in their power to try and win him back. Apparently, they even sent him his copy of the script printed in gold just to take his request literally. But it does seem like Carrey got a lot of creative control this time out, not just because he's been upgraded to top billing for the first time, but he even gets an artistic consultant credit on this movie. So not only do we get regular flavour Ivo Robotnik, the movie pronounces it wrong, so I might as well for the sake of consistency, who has let himself go after his last defeat by Sonic, making him a little bit closer to his game counterpart and spending much of the intervening time binging telenovelas, but we also get his grandfather Gerald, who is looking pretty good for 110 years old. Presumably that's from all the jolts of chaos energy from Shadow's quills, but is essentially an older, fatter, more twisted version of Ivo, whose desire for narcissistic world domination is replaced with nihilistic rage. And the scenes where Carrey is interacting with himself are an absolute delight. I'm sure technically they're an absolute pain in the butt to film, but Carrey brings his usual animated absurdity, whether it's immediately breaking the fourth wall or an elaborate, hysterically warped showstopper dance number through a laser field. Playing against himself, Carrey might have found a co-star who can actually keep up with him. But this Robotnik reunion also ties back into the theme of family, as Ivo finally finds some validation that he's been desperately yearning, even as he doesn't realise that he already has it from his long-suffering partner, henchman, Agent Stone, played by Lee Majdoub, who unfortunately spends much of the third act of the film staring at screens in Piccadilly Circus. Again, if there's an issue with Carrey's performance, it's that Gerald mostly being a grotesque caricature of an old man does make his appearances in Shadow's flashbacks, which are crucial to the film, a little bit weird tonally. It's clearly deliberately downplayed his dark side in favour of the comedy, but that does seem like it's a little bit at the expense of that particular plot line, but otherwise, Carey steals the show, and it's probably the funniest he's been in a very long time on film. Carey's also by far the most prominent human character in this. As more of the cast of the animated characters from the games expands into the films, there's less and less focus being placed on the human characters, which isn't really a criticism. I actually thought they took up a little bit too much screen time in the previous films, but it is worth noting. Obviously, James Marsden and Tika Sumpter return as Team Sonic's surrogate parents, Tom and Maddie, but they're mostly taking a back seat until they join in on a heist plot in the middle portion of the film. So at least they do get a little bit more to do than they did in the second movie. Natasha Rothwell and Shamir Moore also return, but only very briefly as Tom and Maddie's disguises in that very same sequence. Adam Pally is also back as the goofy deputy sheriff, but it's only for one very small scene after he effectively co-stars throughout the entirety of Knuckles. New to the cast this time around is Kristen Ritter as a gun officer who doesn't trust Sonic. She's largely replacing Tom Butler's Commander Walters, who returns for only a couple of scenes here. But the new human cast member leaving the most impression is Isla Brown from Furiosa and Sting in the key role of Maria, whose shadow befriends in his flashbacks and serves as a small glint of hope in a lifetime of experimentation. Brown gives a poignancy to Maria and their relationship in only a handful of scenes, especially so as her role is critical to the film's plot. What I think is notable about the film is how much larger it is in terms of scope and ambition, even compared to the second film going from Tokyo to London to space. It's striking to compare it to the relative small scale of the first film's road movie, and just how much more confident these films have become in themselves and incorporating the source material. You can even see this in the action sequences, which are bigger and more elaborately staged. For my money, the best sequence in the film is actually Sonic's first encounter with Shadow as they speed through the streets of Tokyo, and there's clearly a very big anime influence to a lot of the visuals in these sequences, especially the moment where Shadow does the Akira slide up the side of a tower. When Sonic and Shadow had this huge fight across the third act that spans across continents and even into outer space, for me it was very reminiscent of a Dragon Ball Z battle scene with all the superpowered destruction as they knock themselves into these massive craters. I did think that at times the film nearly got lost in its own bombast, especially in these sequences, where you got two almost identical looking characters fighting each other, so it's very hard to tell them apart until they start speaking. That might be a deliberate choice, but even so, that meant that I was a bit removed from the action. Luckily though, the film remembers the story and its emotional thread again at a crucial moment, and it's that piece of quiet introspection which lands after all the chaos and explosions beforehand. It's a reminder that, if nothing else, there is a genuine heart to these Sonic films when it could just easily be a cynical IP cash grab. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 continues to be on par with the second film. Yes, it is a little bit messy, and yes, the tone is a bit all over the place sometimes, but it's also very entertaining and funny. As I watched it, I thought to myself, this is going to be the favourite movie of a lot of 8-year-olds, and I don't mean that as a dig. And yes, I know there are a lot of older Sonic fans who have grown up with the character. They'll enjoy this too, but you have to remember, it is largely made for kids, and it works for exactly who it's intended for. When an action scene pauses for a comic book pose that's very fan-servicey, this 34-year-old casual viewer might groan a little, but there's probably some kid out there that sees that moment and goes, yeah! That's what a kid does, right? An 8-year-old kid, they go, yeah! It's really hard to knock the Sonic films for being surprisingly good and consistently so for what they are, which is a fun time for kids and plenty of big kids too. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video, or you can go fast to my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks, or you can just simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.